So now the story of the night is about Anne Rosenbaum, manager extraordinaire. She was my mother. And you know, she lived up to that reputation. She managed my awkward, brilliant father from immigrant status to upper middle class textile magnate. And she tried to manage her daughters, but with me she didn't do too well because I was the identified patient. And then, down the line, she managed my father, her husband of many years, as his brain went soft. He got into Alzheimer's. And what she did was she moved from New York City to Oakland. I mean, we had always said, come be with us. But she said, you know, I'm a New Yorker. And she looked at Oakland that way. But when it was time, she moved into Lake Park with him, assisted living, but she did the work. Fierce, loyal. And as we hoped, I mean, I'm going to be blunt, we wanted, you know, he died. This is good at a certain point. And we wanted her to have some life left. And she was a tough old bird, and she did 15 years to find out who was this Anne Rosenbaum when she didn't have to be a manager of upper middle class conformity in New York City. And it turned out she was a wild woman. You have to realize she was very short, and that kind of stiff brown hair had now turned into a silver cap, very impish along with her grin. And she had bright green eyes with deep shadows under them that were there from her baby pictures. The shadows were always there. But here was this woman who, she didn't like to spend money, but she liked stuff, like her daughter. And so she would go to thrift shops and put together these fabulous, wild, colorful outfits. I didn't know she had it in her, with pendants and prints. She was marvelous to look at. And then she did stuff. She played a cutthroat game of bridge. She could knit and watch television simultaneously. She read murder mysteries, a lot of them, at the bookstore. She sat at the cash register for the library in Oakland. Her accountant had a mess of papers. She said, I can file them. A friend, a gay doctor, he had a mess of papers. She said, I can file them. She was out there doing stuff. But the most important thing in her life were her 3 great grandchildren. And I brought them almost from their birth every Friday to Lake Park, where she hosted them, she fed them, she pilfered food for them. I'm sure it kept her alive and kicking. But you know, you get to be in your 90s and things happen. I hate to tell you. But it's realistic. And first I went out with a little T, whatever you call it, little stroke. And then her mobility with a spinal stenosis got hampered. And one by one, all these delicious activities she couldn't do anymore. And finally, this tough-minded, blunt woman said to me and my sister, she said, you know, I'm really tired. I've lived a long, good life. I'm ready to leave. That's what she called it, her euphemism. And she said, I figured it out. I'm just going to stop eating and drinking. And my sister and I, we were okay with this because she was the manager. She could manage her life. And, you know, her doctor was okay with it too. This is a little miracle. He was ready to call hospice, even just because she said, I'm going to stop. But first she needed an exam to make sure that nothing could be fixed. It couldn't. And then she needed a mental exam. Now, by then, she had stopped eating and drinking, and I said, Mom, you better eat and drink something so your mind is clear. You know, otherwise they'll clap you in the hospital. It'll be all over. So the woman, the social worker, came, and she aced the exam. She was very swift in the brain. But in her characteristic bluntness, she said, what a stupid, stupid woman in a stupid test, multiple choice. But now I said, I want to be with you during this process. And she said, no, too painful. And I said, no, it would be an honor. So she said, all right. And so I sat with her for 14 days that it took for this tough old body to break down. And what an extraordinary, magnificent, peculiar experience it was. Hospice, they're great. Get them if you need them. They kept her relatively comfortable. I mean, she was always canted in the bed, and there was a day of discomfort, but this is what I would see. You know, she'd kind of be lying there, and then she'd look up at the ceiling, you know, where the ceiling and the wall met, and she'd have these lively conversations with I don't know who or what. And usually they were pretty jolly, but sometimes they were a little disturbing. And then she'd kind of look up out of those green eyes, and she said, what was going on right there? And I said, well, as far as I have heard, at times like this, the veil between this life and that gets thin. And perhaps those people who are ready to greet you are just warming up. And she, who did not have much of a spiritual bent, said, well, all right. Now, every night when I got ready to leave so I could go to sleep, not that big leave, the small leave, I said, can I go now? And she said, go, go. And so I came and I sat, and it was a combination of sacred and quotidian. You know, that's what these things are. They go on. I read the paper, we listened to classical music, I walked around the lake, etc. But there was the Memorial Day camping trip, which we had taken our family for many, many years. And I said, can I go to the Memorial Day camping trip? And she said, go, go. And the hospice people said, go, go. And my sister, the tough psychologist that she is, she said, well, how would you feel if you went and she died? And I said, well, you know, I think that's kind of what she might like. I've heard that if you're here, you kind of tether them, and if you're gone, they might go. But just before we were ready to leave, the phone rang. It was the hospice chaplain, whom she did not like very much. And he said, you know, your mother has decided she's going to eat and drink again. It's just too boring to lie here. And so she did. And I felt this, you know, I was ready to release her, but I felt this joy rising up in me. But guess what happened? When we got back, her fast was working. The old organs felt the lack of food and drink, and they were starting to fail naturally. Now, this was much easier on our daughter and the grandchildren, because they were very attached to Grandma Ann. And my daughter said, what kind of message is that to send to children? You're tired, you're bored, things don't work well, you're going to check out? But now she was on her way. And so there I was. I took a leave from work. I was sitting and watching and walking and reading. And finally, it was July 4th. And the hospice worker who had brought her in the first place, a lovely woman, happened to be there because it was a holiday. No one was left. And she stood holding my mother's feet, which were kind of blue and cold and very high arched with hammer toes because she was a poor kid and her shoes never fit. And she looked down at Mother and she said, you know, today, Anne, could be your Independence Day. Now, here I am on one side of the bed, and there on the other side of the bed is my cousin Vikitsa, who happens to be here tonight, who thought of my mother as a grandmother. And we were trying to be respectful and quiet, you know. And then I realized all of a sudden my mother was not lying at an angle. She was lying kind of as if she were in a chute, you know, ready. And I said, you know, hearing is the last to go, and I think she'd like to hear that we were doing just fine. So we started talking. We started gossiping. We laughed a little. And then Vikitsa walked off with the television my mother wanted her to take. And then it was shift change, time for the morphine shot. And we stood and looked, and my mother took one breath, and then no breath. That was it. It was, you know, as they say, peaceful, surrounded by her family. Well, we two of surround and one of peace, and all the wrinkles smoothed out. She looked absolutely beatific, if a little waxy. And I called my daughter, and she came, and we sat on opposite sides with this husk of Anne Rosenbaum until Neptune Society came. Sure enough, the manager had arranged that a long time ago. And they wrapped her in velour, and they wheeled her away. What did we do? We went into the bathroom where all her worldly goods had been boxed up, because she said, I don't want to spend an extra day's rent at that place. And we cleared it all out. And we went to Indian Hill in Berkeley, and we lay on our backs, and we watched The fireworks. Leave it to the manager to arrange that we would never forget when she died and how she lived. Kapow. It's been 12 years. She's right here. You feel her? Yes. Thank you.